What happens when the world's largest democracy is torn in half overnight? What if the fate of millions of people, their homes, their families, and their futures rested on a single, controversial decision? In 1947, something catastrophic happened that changed everything. A country was carved into two pieces in a moment of desperation, leaving behind not just new borders, but a deep wound that would never fully heal. 15 million people displaced, entire cities abandoned, families split apart. This wasn't just the birth of two nations. This was the creation of a disaster that echoed through history. And at the heart of it all was a simple question. Could the world's largest subcontinent really survive a division so deep, so violent, that the scars would still exist more than 70 years later? Hold on. Here's where it gets really intense. Imagine being handed the responsibility of dividing a country as vast and diverse as India, with little knowledge of its people. This was a reality for Sir Cyril Radcliffe, the man tasked with drawing the new borders. Radcliffe had never set foot in India. He didn't understand the complexities of its history or the deep-rooted communities living side by side. Yet, in just 5 weeks, he was to create a line that would forever change the lives of millions. The Radcliffe Line, which divided India from Pakistan, was drawn hastily. It wasn't just a geographical boundary. It was a line of devastation. Villages, towns, and cities were split. Families that had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the border. Imagine waking up one day, realizing that your home, your life, no longer belongs to you. Now, let's talk numbers. Mind-blowing numbers. Over 15 million people were displaced in a matter of weeks. That's like the entire population of a country the size of Belgium or Hungary, all on the move. Refugees, Hindus and Sikhs fleeing to India, Muslims rushing to Pakistan, travel by any means possible, on foot by train, even in carts pulled by oxen. But this wasn't an ordinary migration. This was a race against time, against violence, against death. Picture this scene. A young girl, no older than 12, clutches her mother's hand as they march across a burning plain. Around them, the sky is painted orange as villages burn, their homes reduced to ash. At every stop, a new horror: violence, theft, murder. The fear was palpable. Refugees faced one horrifying reality after another. And between 200,000 and 2 million people lost their lives. The partition wasn't just a political division. It unleashed a savage wave of violence. Punjab, the heart of the division, saw the worst of it. Imagine this. Communities that had lived together for centuries suddenly turned into enemies. Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were no longer neighbors. They were targets. Mobs roamed the streets, fueled by hatred, fear, and political ideology. Families were slaughtered, houses burned, and entire towns wiped off the map. In Lahore, Amritsar, and Calcutta, the violence erupted in full force. It wasn't just a political war. It was a war of identity, of survival. The streets were soaked in blood, and every corner seemed to harbor terror. Refugees crossing into new countries didn't just face an uncertain future. They faced a nightmare of violence and hatred from those they once called neighbors. Now, here's where the plot thickens even further. As India and Pakistan split, the question of Kashmir loomed large. Kashmir, a region with a Muslim-majority population, became a flashpoint. Who would control it? Both India and Pakistan staked their claim. This wasn't just a dispute, it was a spark that ignited a war. In October 1947, the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, under a Hindu ruler, decided to accede to India. But Pakistan wasn't having it. The First Indo-Pakistani War erupted in 1947-48, and Kashmir was at the center of it. The Kashmir conflict didn't end in 1948. It still rages today. The region remains a territory of bitter rivalry, with both countries claiming it as their own. And the borders, drawn in 1947, are still the root cause of the tensions between these nuclear-armed neighbors. In the aftermath of partition, the violence began to subside, but the wounds remained deep. India and Pakistan were born from this chaos, but they were born from a history of bloodshed. The refugee crisis continued for years, with millions resettling in new homes. But the divide wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A generation grew up with the trauma of partition, of loss, of fear. It's a scar that both countries still carry. India, the world's largest democracy, has grown into a global economic power. But it still bears the scars of partition, especially in regions like Kashmir, where violence continues to flare up. Pakistan, a nation built on the idea of religious separation, still struggles with its own identity. The legacy of partition continues to shape the geopolitics of South Asia in ways no one could have predicted. Even now, 70 years later, the echoes of partition continue to reverberate. The conflict over Kashmir has led to several wars between India and Pakistan, and tensions have not subsided. Political differences, religious divides, and national identities still draw battle lines in the region. But more than anything, partition is a painful reminder of what happens when division overcomes unity. It's a lesson in the destructive power of borders, of hatred, of fear. And the million-dollar question remains: could this tragedy have been avoided? Could India have stayed united? Or was this division inevitable? The partition of India remains one of the most profound events in the history of South Asia. It reshaped borders, politics, and the lives of millions. The violence, the loss, the displacement, it's a legacy that continues to define the region even today. It's not just a historical event. It's a living wound that is not healed. The partition teaches us that borders aren't just lines on a map. They're the dividing lines of history, culture, and identity. What happened in 1947 wasn't just the birth of two nations. It was the birth of a conflict that still shapes the world.